Welcome back, folks. Um, Hope we're all well and surviving the joys of lockdown. It's weird, isn't it? If you remember, we've been looking at the 50s, Britain in the 50s, and got a couple of things more I want to look about that, or three things actually. I want to look at Suez, which will be today. I want to look at Macmillan and Eden, particularly Macmillan, and then I want to think about the end of the Conservative governments, which will be a bit of a fun one. And then overall, your job is going to be, of course, to start thinking about the usual question, really, were these any good wasted years, question mark. Today I want to think about Suez, and not about the Suez crisis per se. Most of you know the ins and outs of that, and if you want the ins and outs properly, and I suggest you do, because it's a cracking documentary, watch the documentary, that's the BBC one that's under this. Instead, I want to think about Suez as a kind of concept, and in particular about the idea of post-Suez. We talk about pre and post-Suez. It's one of those places that's entered the sort of language like Munich in history. You know, we talk about Munich, we all mean appeasement. Well, Suez is the same kind of thing. When we say post-Suez, we're talking about really the recognition that Britain was no longer the Britain it once had been. It's not really a cause of that process. It's not a cause of the end of Britain's great power status, although it is a catalyst, I think. But more, really, it's a signpost. And that's what it was to people at the time. I think that's why it matters most of all, actually, is because I think pre-Suez, you could kind of pretend. We'll talk about pretending in a moment. Post-Suez, you couldn't. Just do the basics. I mean, you can do it yourselves pretty easily, can't you? You know, before the First World War, great global power. Even between the wars, though, I think much forgotten, Britain was still, in many ways, the predominant global power. Many of you will know, banging on about the Second World War, I always say, plucky little Britain is an absolute myth. Britain was a great power. And the truth be told, that it's only really after the Second World War that Britain's great power status is pretty much going. And going is the term to use here, because actually, if you take a look at Britain after the Second World War, it's not immediately evident. Now, you see, it's possible to have a go at the likes of the Attleys and your Bevins, your Churchills, your Edens, and say, well, they should have seen the writing on the wall. Well, the writing on the wall wasn't quite as clear as hindsight allows us to see it. For a start, Britain had and still had a world role. It had forces deployed across the globe. It was a world imperial power. It had a seat on the UN Security Council. It was developing and developed successfully in the 50s its independent nuclear deterrent. It played significant roles in the Korean War. It played significant roles all across the globe. So Britain was not, self-evidently no longer a player. And of course, it had been part of the Big Three, a concept Churchill tries to revive unsuccessfully in the 50s. Then there was the Middle East. And we forget this now, but Britain was actually in many ways the major player in the Middle East after the Second World War. Britain was the major influence over countries like Iraq and even Iran as well. And the creation of the Baghdad Pact in 1955 illustrated in some ways that Britain was still a significant global player in the Middle East. In many ways, was the significant player in the Middle East. And you could say the same actually about Western Europe. Because of hindsight, we all bang on about the European coal and steel community. But if you look at the major initiatives towards closer Western European cooperation in the immediate post-war period, before the EEC, which we'll come to in a minute, but they are things like, Council of Europe, NATO, Marshall Plan, all of those were British-led. So as far as Western Europe, and Britain was still the dominant player in the Western Europe. And the story that shows this is a much forgotten story now about the creation of an obscure thing called the Western European Union. In 1949, West Germany is given statehood, sort of de facto and developing de jure, and by 1955, West Germany is rearming. Now, the Americans wanted this. The Korean War showed that being global superpowers comes very expensive. West Germany had a rapidly growing economy, so they should take some responsibility for their own defence. But of course, the idea of a West German army gave Paris the absolute willies, and you can't blame them, can you? It's 1870, 1914, 1940. The proposal from a French politician, René Pleven, had been to create basically a European army, the European Defence Community. And the idea was effectively this meant that West German troops, West German forces, would not ultimately be under West German command, so therefore wouldn't go around invading France as they traditionally had. The irony is French politics is very unstable in this period, and indeed this effectively was close to a coup d'etat by de Gaulle in 1957. Algeria is wrecking French politics in this era, I think. The truth is, the French rejected it themselves. They rejected their own plan because of the instabilities of French politics in the era. And the fear became, I mean, this is as serious as this, the fear came in about 53, 54 that NATO would actually collapse. The man who rode to the rescue was Sir Anthony Eden. Eden proposed the creation of something called the Western European Union, but more importantly, what this really said was an agreement that the Germans would rearm, but that British and American troops would be permanently stationed in West Germany, and that was the case for Britain up until very recently. This would, of course, guarantee that the Germans wouldn't go around being naughty and thereby reassure the French. The point is, Britain had taken that leading role. And incidentally, I think that's one reason why Britain didn't set much store by the negotiations to create a possible common market, a customs union, an EEC that began in Messina in 1956. The point being, if you're in Eden's shoes, it didn't necessarily look as if Britain no longer had, okay, not the dominant world role anymore, but a very important global, imperial, Middle Eastern and European role. Now, we know the writing is on the wall. We know about superpowers. We know the bipolar world. We know that there was no room for Britain as a sort of a third force. And the story of Suez shows this intimately. Britain didn't clear it with the Americans. The Americans were more interested in their interests in the Middle East than they were at this moment in Britain. The Americans, in effect, forced Britain to put a stop to Suez. And the second reason for that was another underlying problem, and that was sterling. What really grinds Britain to a halt at this point was the fact that sterling was so weak that when the Americans effectively started selling it, and Britain then said, okay, we're going to need to go to the IMF, the Americans said, well, you can do, but only if you pull out of Suez. And a realization of all of this was Britain's increasing reliance on nuclear weapons. Okay, Britain, in effect, could no longer have conventional forces sufficient to pull its power around the world in the way it might want. So it adopted a policy effectively relying on the American nuclear deterrent and then on its own, but that in the end turned out to be American, as we'll discuss in a moment. The truth is, what Suez showed the world, and that's just as important, also then showed number 10 and the Foreign Office, was Britain was no longer the independent actor it had imagined itself to be. And post-Suez, Britain has to reorientate its position in the world. A rather cruel but I think accurate quip of Dean Acheson's comes to mind here when he said that Britain had lost an empire but failed to find a role. He said that a few years later. And what we see in Britain under Macmillan and what's to follow, I think actually trying to regain a kind of role. So under Macmillan, what do we see? Well, we'll see, I think, here's this idea of Greece to Rome. Britain is Greece to America's Rome. Now, of course, if you know your classical history, right, ancient history, Greece was the place to be with all their philosophers and all that kind of stuff. And then, of course, the Romans come along and they're much more brash and sort of they build things and all that kind of stuff. And what's Greece going to do? Well, Greece, of course, can give them the poetry, the language, and, I don't know, some nice olive oil, perhaps. That's kind of Britain. Macmillan saw Britain's role as being, if you like, a friend, a cultural benefactor, a fount of wisdom to the brash, but maybe not quite so wise Americans. I don't think the Americans saw it that way, incidentally. The second change is Polaris. Britain had tried to develop its own independent nuclear deterrent, but that was a bomb. By the mid-50s, bombs were beginning to go out of fashion. By 1957, 58, they were dead out of fashion because we're now talking about intercontinental ballistic missiles. Britain tries to develop its own ballistic missile system, Blue Streak. Unfortunately, Blue Streak is shiny, new, impressive, wonderful, and doesn't work. So we went for the American alternative, Skybolt, which was shiny, new, beautiful, even more expensive, even more impressive, and didn't work. The Americans did have a system that did work, and that was Polaris. And Britain, in the end, in the Nassau Agreement, 61, I think, 61, 62, adopt the Polaris missile system, an American submarine-launched ballistic missile system as an ultimate nuclear deterrent, the price for which is giving the Americans, by the way, nuclear bases for their Polaris system in Britain as well. The truth is, though, Britain has an independent nuclear deterrent if the Americans are happy. So what's left? Well, of course, winds of change. Yes, from empire to Commonwealth. The problem was that the Commonwealth didn't add up to much. And really, what Winds of Change is an acknowledgement by Macmillan that winds of change, nationalism is sweeping the African continent, but really it's a shorthand, we use it for the end of empire. And in the 60s, the British Empire will dissolve. We always imagine peacefully, not quite sure. This was the period of the Mau Mau emergency, a period of pretty brutal British colonial rule, to be frank with you. And, other ends of empire could be pretty messy. Though, truth be told, compared to Britain and France, we probably were less messy. Nonetheless, Commonwealth added up to about 10% of Britain's trade. Meanwhile, EFTA, TINA, and the EC. What are they? Well, the EC is created in 1957 to Britain's surprise. They never imagined it would work. Britain had set up an alternative plan, which they thought would be like the WU would be to the EDC. In other words, once the Continentals had cocked it up, Britain would come to the rescue with the European Free Trade Association, which would be a grouping of European states that would agree to free trade agreements. This sounds familiar, doesn't it? EFTA was a sparkling... No, it wasn't. EFTA was a dismal failure. Partly because the economies involved didn't matter much. I mean, be frank, Ireland and Sweden and Denmark I'm very fond of, but let's be brutal about this. They're not West Germany or France. The EC, meanwhile, took off big time. And in 1962, TINA, there is no alternative. Famously, Macmillan changed course. He'd already mentally done that before and applied for EC entry. We didn't get it because de Gaulle says non. But that was a recognition that Britain's future now was not as a global power, it was as a Western European power with global influence. In other words, what had really happened post-Suez was global Britain was no more. Politically, this has an unfortunate side effect, and that was becoming increasingly, I think, of a Little Englandism. I think that's personified above all else in the person of Harold Wolseley, who was a Little Englander at heart. And the increasing reliance on World War II as a kind of foundation myth because we haven't got anything else to boast about anymore. And a kind of forgetfulness, it's almost blotted out of the British memory now that we were the world's great global power. There's a kind of post-Suez mental effect in which we just kind of forget. We as a nation decide to forget that we were this global power. And instead we were the plucky little Britain of the Second World War, which we never were, and that we are somehow a little England. And that is our true nature. A good look at the 1950s is to recognise that none of the politicians of that period would want that to be so, nor would they have recognised it. I think that's quite an important thing to understand if we're going to understand particularly Anthony Eden and indeed the man who had to clear up the mess, Harold Macmillan. More of which next time.